Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the passage in the House today of a spending bill to fund the government by a vote of 217 to 214 that gives DHS 2 weeks of funding, during which new rules for ICE, CBP and DHS will be debated and worked out, as Democrats are standing firm on reining in ICE, with much of the country behind them, while Trump is on the defensive. Joining us is Robert Kuttner, the co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect and the Ida and Meyer Kirsten Chair at Brandeis University. He was formerly an assistant to the legendary I.F. Stone, a chief investigator for the Senate Banking Committee, and for 20 years wrote a column at Businessweek. His books include Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism? And Going Big, FDR's Legacy, Biden's New Deal, and the Struggle to Save Democracy. And he has an article at the American Prospect we'll discuss, No Time to Compromise on ICE. Then we'll examine further the abuses of ICE and DHS, with a spending spree underway to buy warehouses to hold more than 73,000 immigrants now in detention, and an additional 76,500 by warehousing them to make their lives so miserable they will agree to waive their rights and be deported, in a form of torture which we, the taxpayers, are funding. Joining us is Emma Winger, a staff attorney with the American Immigration Council, where she works to protect the rights of non-citizens through affirmative litigation, amicus briefs, and practice advisories for immigration attorneys. She has an article at the American Immigration Council, ICE's secret policy to forcibly enter homes without a judicial warrant threatens all Americans. Then finally we'll speak with Julia Azari, who is a professor of political science at Marquette University. She is the author of Delivering the People's Message, The Changing Politics of the Presidential Mandate, and the editor of The Presidential Leadership Dilemma Between the Constitution and a Political Party. Her latest book is Backlash, Presidents, From Transformative to Reactionary Leaders in American History, which documents how reactionary racist backlashes of white victimhood had Andrew Johnson following reformer Abe Lincoln, Richard Nixon following LBJ, and Trump following Obama. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now, Robert Kuttner, the co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect. His books include Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism? And he has an article at the American Prospect, No Time to Compromise on ICE. Welcome to Background Briefing, Robert Kuttner.
Always a pleasure, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And today the House of Representatives passed this spending package that will end the government shutdown, which started on Saturday. The vote was 217 to 214. Now it's on its way for Trump to sign, which is expected to happen soon. Most Democrats, 193, voted against this deal. And interestingly enough, 21 Democrats voted for it, and 21 Republicans voted against it. So that's how you ended up with 217 to 214. So what do you make of this, Bob?
Well, don't forget, this only bought Congress 2 weeks. The deal was they have sort of reached agreement in principle on several constraints on ICE. ID, no masks, independent investigations of abuses, no arrests of American citizens, limits on deportations, limits on the cooperation demanded of local law enforcement. And so now they've got 2 weeks to turn these rough agreements in principle, which were the basis for this 2 week deal, into enforceable mechanisms. And one of the things that's happened in the past week is that the House, which was a little bit more inclined to go along than the Senate was, is now somewhat more adamant than the Senate. And the version of the demands that, interestingly enough, the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the New Democrat Caucus, which is the more centrist Democrats, jointly put out, is somewhat to the left, if you will, of what Schumer agreed to. So you're going to have four-way disagreements between the House and Senate Democrats and between different factions of Republicans. And all of this has to come together over the next 2 weeks, or the government shuts down big time. And I think the Democrats really have the leverage in this case because they're not going to back down on enforceable provisions limiting ICE. So this is just a 2 week respite. It ain't over.
Well, but surely there's a problem here because if you defund DHS, you don't defund ICE. ICE has a separate pot of money coming out of the big, bad, beautiful bill.
Yeah, but the administration cannot have DHS not funded. DHS does a lot of other stuff. And
Right.
if DHS ends up not being funded because the administration and the Republicans in Congress insist on all kinds of increasingly unpopular prerogatives for ICE, advantage Democrats. So Democrats have the leverage here because, DHS does a whole bunch of other stuff. And unlike last time, where they succeeded in making this the Democrats' fault, or at least kind of a 50-50 responsibility, ICE is monumentally unpopular. And the Republicans don't want a storyline where the government shuts down because they refuse to go along with constraints on ICE.
So does that mean then that ICE will no longer wear masks and they will no longer abuse the Fourth Amendment? I mean, how far will the Democrats be able to exercise their leverage?
Yeah, I think pretty far. I mean, Kristi Noem yesterday, I guess, already announced that ICE is going to stop wearing masks. So the Republicans are trying to give a little bit to show that they're also on the side of public opinion here. So we'll have to see. But Hakeem Jeffries, the House Democratic leader, sounded rather tougher than Schumer on this, and of course it has to pass both houses. So it's going to be a very interesting couple of weeks. It ain't over. That's my point. And public opinion is so strongly on the Democrat side. I mean, the state Senate special election in Texas on Saturday is absolute stunner. And what's interesting about that election is that it was independents and Republicans who put this guy over the top. It wasn't, a case of huge Democratic turnout. It was a case of Republicans and independents deserting Trump. And, this was a seat that Trump had carried by 17 points, and the Democrat won it by 14 points. That's a swing of 31 points. That's unheard of in a deep red district. And so I think the Republicans are panicking, justifiably so. They're losing public opinion.
So in terms of the sausage making, Robert Kuttner, in the Senate, Lindsey Graham was a holdout because
Yeah, but that was a parochial thing that Graham was making a fuss over. This was his $500 billion slush fund for pain and suffering, whatever. I mean,
right.
they shut him down very quickly.
Right. He wanted $1 million of taxpayers' money to compensate him for the alleged invasion of his privacy by Jack Smith, who called for the metadata on the phone records, which has nothing to do with tapping a phone. It just tells when the call happened, how long it lasted, and who it was to. They obviously wanted to find out who Trump was communicating with on January the 6th. So, but then in the sausage making in the House today, a lot of the Republicans wanted to slip the SAVE Act in, which is incredibly noxious, which would basically mean the Republicans would take over elections and mail-in voting and force a national ID. So that obviously didn't work, right?
I'm guessing what happened because the arithmetic is too perfect for it not to have happened. I'm guessing that Jeffries made a deal with the speaker, and the speaker probably said to Jeffries, I got 21 Republicans who really don't want to vote for this. Can you please get me 21 Democrats? And they agreed to that. So now they're going to have 2 weeks to fight over the specifics. Otherwise, it's just a little bit too coincidental and a little bit too perfect.
Right. So does this mean then that Donald Trump won the day in terms of these backroom deals that you just alluded to, Bob? How much sway does Trump still exercise? Because he's basically told the House Republicans to vote for this bill and not to mess with it.
Well, look, what Trump wanted to do more than anything else, and all of his actions in the past few days indicate this, Trump wanted to get ICE off TV. He wanted to get all the horrible things that have happened in Minneapolis off the front pages. And so he had a two-part strategy. One, get Homans in there and make some concessions on the ground and start talking nice to the mayor and the governor. And then two, have the outlines of a deal, details to be filled in later, that makes it seem like the Republicans and the Democrats are jointly going to go along with some constraints on ICE. So to that extent, Trump has bought himself 2 weeks. But if the Republicans hold out for prerogatives for ICE that are wrong-headed and unpopular, this goes right back onto the front pages.
So let's walk through some of the suggestions that you have in your article, Robert Kuttner, No Time to Compromise on ICE, and let us know what you think might be able to survive this 2-week pause before the wrangling begins, or during which, I guess, wrangling begins. One, ensure ICE and CPB immediately leave Minneapolis and stop terrorizing American cities and communities.
Well, that's general.
Right.
So what that means is drawdown. Homan has already promised this. The only question is how much of a drawdown.
2, end arrest without judicial warrants and outside of existing standards, circumstances.
That's a big one. And ICE, out of whole cloth, because memos were leaked, that's how we know this, invented the idea that there could be administrative warrants. Now, this is in flat contradiction of the Fourth Amendment, which requires probable cause to be certified by a judge. And this will not stand up in court, period. Now, it may take a while for it to work its way through the courts. I'm guessing that the Republicans are going to have to give on this one. I mean, ICE cannot be in the position of issuing its own warrants.
And number 3, ensure full, independent, and transparent investigations into all DHS-related shootings.
Well, they're the devils in the details. I mean, the Minnesota officials and the Democrats in Congress are saying the Justice Department, which has been totally politicized, and DHS, which of course ICE is part of, cannot be trusted to investigate themselves. And I think the Democrats are going to hang very tough on that one. Although, again, the details of how it would actually work would have to be worked out. So, for example, let's assume that there's another horrific ICE abuse, because there will be, and then there's an investigation. Is it fully joint investigation? Do the state authorities take the lead on it? So that's one where the devil's in the details, and they got to work out the details.
For and the detention, deportation of U.S. citizens.
Well, that's axiomatic. You can't deport U.S. citizens.
Right.
And there have been a couple of cases where where somebody is the child of an undocumented immigrant, but who's born in the United States, who then gets deported along with the parents. So then again, that's axiomatic, and
Mm.
they only end up deporting U.S. citizens either because they defy a court order or because the court didn't find out about it in time. So that shouldn't even be controversial.
Right, and then ending the anonymity of federal agents by requiring them to remove their masks. Well, we already discussed that. Number 6, ensure robust minimum standards of care at detention facilities, including access to medical care, clean water, and edible food, and
Yeah,
protections against abuse.
and that's a big one. And again, that's going to have to be negotiated in detail. That's more complicated. That's happening all over the place. And the question is who would monitor that, who would enforce that, and so that's a little trickier. The other one, by the way, is body cameras. They've already agreed to that. So they're trying to agree to the easy stuff, just to take the Republicans, just to take some of the pressure off if they can.
So, what's going to happen then with calls from Democrats to remove or impeach DHS Secretary Kristi Noem? I mean, she's basically just decoration, right? She's the costume changing ice Barbie. It's her boyfriend runs DHS, Corey Lewandowski, and he's in turn run by Stephen Miller. So, if you want to get some justice and clean house, you got to go after Stephen Miller, surely.
This is true, although I think it would be a real smackdown of the Trump administration if the Democrats could muster the votes to impeach Kristi Noem. It would also, by the way, since that has to be tried in the Senate, put a number of Republican senators who really find Kristi Noem to be an embarrassment, would put them on the spot. And getting rid of Lewandowski and Miller, that's tougher. But you do this incrementally. You build political strength incrementally, and that would demonstrate again that public opinion is against what the administration's doing.
So, how do you think this issue with ICE and the revulsion throughout the country, and you mentioned the vote in Texas where independents and Republicans put the Democrat way over the top, how much are the Democrats going to seize upon this idea that, what Trump and Miller are doing is he's declaring war on American people? And
I,
this is,
Totally. I think this is such a losing issue for the administration. It's such a winning issue, not just for Democrats, but for any decent human being. And they're not going to let go of this. For once, they're not going to wimp out. And I think Texas proves it. And I think they have the advantage, and they're going to do what they can to maximize the advantage. Why would they wimp out now? And I think the fact, I've never seen anything like this. The fact that the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the Congressional New Democrat Caucus jointly put out a list of demands that's to the left of Schumer's list. That's just unbelievable. And, that's a tribute to Greg Casar, the new head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, but still, that's just unbelievable.
well, it is so ripe for reform. Many even think DHS, well, particularly ICE, should be abolished altogether. So, given that we're talking about reform, is there any real way to reform the kind of people that are in ICE and and the Border Patrol and CBP?
Well, that's
It's
that's
always
another issue, by the way, that did not make it onto the list. But if I were making my own list, I would say, stop recruiting thugs to go to work for ICE. That's another issue that's going to keep coming up because if you recruit thugs, then and don't train them, then you're going to have abuses. So this is going to keep coming up. It's. I agree with you, Ian. It's beyond reform. What you can try and do is constrain it, keep it out of cities, but then it can do its horrible stuff in the Border Patrol. And I also agree with you that you know maybe break up DHS, and DHS only dates to after 9/11, and return these subparts to the agencies that they used to be part of.
But Border Patrol has always been problematic, and today we learned that the identities of the two shooters of Alex Preddy, who pumped 10 bullets into his back, both of them have Hispanic surnames. That's a strange turn of events, is it not?
I wouldn't make too much of that. I mean, I have a Jewish surname, so what? It's too small a sample.
Right. But in general, what isn't there a long history of Border Patrol and CBP being pretty rogue? We focus on ICE being rogue, but they've been rogue for a long time.
You're absolutely right. And it's only by comparison with ICE that Border Patrol, it doesn't look quite so horrible. But yeah, it is in overwhelming need of reform as well.
Well, I thank you for joining us here today, and let's stay in touch because this is going to be a pretty boisterous 2 weeks.
It sure is. Thanks, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Robert Kuttner, who's the co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect and the Ida and Meyer Kirstein Chair at Brandeis University. He was formerly an assistant to the legendary I.F. Stone, chief investigator for the Senate Banking Committee, and for 20 years wrote a column at Business Week. His books include Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism and Going Big, FDR's Legacy, Biden's New Deal, and the Struggle to Save Democracy. And he has an article at the American Prospect, No Time to Compromise on ICE. We're going to take a brief station break and back examining further the abuses of ICE and DHS as they warehouse immigrants, making their lives so miserable they'll agree to waive their rights and be deported in a form of torture which we, the taxpayers, are funding.
Trump's federal thugs beat up on his face and his chest. Then we heard the gunshots and Alex Preddy lay in the snow dead. Their claim was self-defense, sir. Just don't believe your eyes. It's our blood and bones and these whistles and foams against Miller and Noam's dirty lies. Oh, I'm Minneapolis, I hear your voice crying through the bloody mist. We'll remember the names of those who died on the streets of Minneapolis.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Emma Winger, who is a staff attorney with the American Immigration Council, where she works to protect the rights of non-citizens through affirmative litigation, amicus briefs, and practice advisories for immigration attorneys. She has an article at the American Immigration Council, ICE's secret policy to forcibly enter homes without a judicial warrant threatens all Americans. Welcome to Background Briefing, Emma Winger.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you're quoted extensively in an article at Bloomberg. ICE begins buying mega warehouse detention centers across the U.S. And the article points out that ICE is on a spending spree. They just acquired 2 warehouses alone for $172 million. They're looking at 23 more warehouses, one in El Paso, Texas, to hold 8,500 beds. And only a couple of weeks ago, they paid $102 million for a site in Hagerstown, Maryland. And they also dropped $70 million in cash for a warehouse in Surprise, Arizona. So they have pretty deep pockets, right, ICE? They're even independently funded from DHS, and DHS, of course, is the subject of the government shutdown deal, where in 2 weeks' time we'll find out what kind of reforms happen. So is there any limit to what ICE can spend in buying warehouses across the country? Because a lot of local communities and politicians are resisting the purchases of warehouses.
Well, certainly there's at present not a real financial limit, as you mentioned, through the One Beautiful Bill Act. ICE has enormous funding to put towards expanding its detention capacity. To the extent that there are limits, they are logistical and one might hope constitutional and statutory. There might be legal limits to how many people they can lawfully detain, but in terms of money, they've got a lot to spend.
Well, apparently at this moment there are 73,000 people in ICE custodies, and these news sites will bring in an additional 76,500 beds. This is according to documents shared with Bloomberg News. And you're quoted as saying that to reach these kind of numbers, ICE needs to go out into the communities and find people who've been living their lives and been here a long time. They'd have to dramatically increase their presence in communities across the country. So this is a sort of chicken and egg situation, is it? Where you build the facilities and then you got to go out and round up more people. Is that how it's working?
Well, I mean, I think that's how ICE looks at it. You know, I will say something that is sort of lost in these conversations sometimes is we're talking about civil immigration laws. ICE can enforce those laws, and immigration judges can order people deported, and people can be deported without locking them up at all. So, you know, I think the idea that everybody that ICE wants to remove has to be locked up through that process is just wrong. But if they are going to spend the money for all of this capacity, they're going to have to presumably to justify it, they're going to have to arrest way more people than they are currently arresting now. And as everybody has seen, they are very aggressively arresting people across the country. So it's potentially even more dramatic immigration enforcement to come.
Well, this, of course, is meeting with a lot of resistance, even in red states. Local politicians, governors, and state representatives and mayors are stopping real estate companies, for example, from selling properties or showing properties to ICE. The one that I mentioned in Hagerstown in Maryland that was recently purchased for $102 million, there was substantial demonstrations against that in 20 below freezing temperatures on January the 20th. And the U.S. Senator Chris Van Hollen told the protesters, one of the most obscene, one of the most inhumane, one of the most illegal operations being carried out by this Trump administration is what they're doing at the Department of Homeland Security and ICE. We do not want an ICE facility here in the state of Maryland. So are you following this, Emma? And how do you see the array of forces here? The money of ICE versus people power in terms of local outrage against facilities in their neighborhood?
Yeah, you know, I'm obviously inspired to see communities pushing back against this dramatic expansion of incarceration in this country. I mean, it's a struggle, both questions about what states and localities can do lawfully to try to limit immigration detention, you know, that's being bought and sold by private landlords, private operators, and also what communities can do to exert political pressure and exert pressure on private landlords and private companies. But, you know, it doesn't surprise me that as people witness the violence that's happening both on the streets and then in detention facilities, where the number of people that have died in ICE detention in January is just horrifying, in just 1 month. It doesn't surprise me that people are rising up and saying we don't want to support this in our communities.
So we, of course, the taxpayers are paying for this, and it came out of the big, beautiful bill, and that came about because the Republicans took money away from healthcare to give massive tax breaks for billionaires, and they were able to find extra money, 170 billion for DHS and ICE. So that's money. I don't know what kind of monitoring there is on this money. A lot of it's going to these two big private prison companies, CoreCivic and Geo Group. And we don't know, for example, what's happening there, what kind of auditing goes on. We know that Tom Homan, the so-called border czar, who was caught with an FBI sting accepting $50,000 in cash, which he's never returned or won't even talk about, he's got his proteges in CoreCivic and Geo Group at the highest levels. So what's happening here in terms of once they round up these people and start warehousing them, why are they warehousing them if they say they want to deport them? Because my understanding is they make money per head of people and they charge the taxpayer for whatever food and lodging, etc. And I'm sure they mark it up considerably. So is this an incentive to capture people and just to warehouse them in order to make money?
I would say, at least from my experience, that ICE is warehousing people because ICE is using detention as a tool to coerce people into waiving their rights. Detention conditions have deteriorated significantly. They were never good. They have gotten much worse as the number of people detained has gone up so dramatically. And they are detaining many, many people, right, through indiscriminate enforcement. So they're detaining people with no criminal histories, people with viable paths to lawful status, people who have been here for decades, people with U.S. citizen family members, people who could apply or currently are applying, have pending applications for legal status in the United States, asylum and otherwise. And this administration is using detention and the threat of indefinite detention and the conditions of detention to coerce people to abandon those rights and to accept deportation. That is what I have seen as to why ICE is warehousing people, how ICE is using detention, frankly, very effectively in its campaign for mass deportation.
So, Emma, that would explain then why ICE is arresting people who show up lawfully for hearings before immigration judges. We've seen video of people being grabbed in the corridors in courthouses. So this is their practice? This is what
That's exactly it, right? They're arresting people who they know who have been voluntarily appearing for court proceedings, who are no danger to the community, who are not likely to flee. People have been following the rules, doing what has been asked of them, and they are arresting them and they're holding them with the obvious purpose of using detention to coerce them to giving up their claims and being deported. Absolutely.
So, without being overdramatic, Emma, it would seem to me that our government is involved in a form of torture, because if you make life so miserable for people stuck in warehouses, particularly in the South and down in Texas near the border where it's incredibly hot, and you've got people stuffed in there, and you've got measles outbreaks in some of these facilities, and it's obviously a horrible place to be, and you're breaking up families, and you've got children there. If this is what it's about, in order to make life so miserable that they'll eventually accept deportation, this is something you'd expect. In fact, it's going on in Russia and places like that, but not here in the United States. Am I being overdramatic to suggest this is a form of torture?
I don't think it's over dramatic. They may not be pulling out people's fingernails, but they're using really cruel conditions of confinement and sometimes actual threats of force to force people to give up their rights. And so I don't think you're exaggerating.
So will any of this come up in the next 2 weeks as the Democrats and the Republicans try to make a deal over ICE, which is a part of this bill that just passed the House today and Trump's about to sign? This is a 2-week moratorium. DHS has got enough money for the next 2 weeks. By the way, ICE has a separate pot of money, so they're not affected by it. But this is the moment for, not just a national debate on ICE, but also a moment for the Democrats and Republicans to hammer this out. Are they going to be talking about what we're talking about, Emma?
I mean, I certainly hope so. I think from what we've heard, there does seem to be finally some real concern about how ICE is enforcing immigration laws, or violating the laws and Constitution in the process. And so this is perhaps an opportunity for Congress to finally step up and exert its power as of the purse, its power of oversight, to both potentially cut funding from this clearly lawless agency, and also input meaningful limits on how it goes about enforcing immigration laws, and oversight, so that there's some teeth to those provisions. Whether that will happen or not is frankly above my pay grade, but this is an opportunity for that.
But we have skin in the game, don't we, as taxpayers? This is our money that's going to CoreCivic and Geo Group and ICE. And they're making money on a per-day basis as they make life miserable in a form of torture to force people into accepting deportation. So they win through cruelty. They get paid on a daily basis for warehousing people as they make them, literally torture them so that they'll leave the country. So this is what we're doing. And so don't we as citizens have skin in the game, because this is what we're funding?
Absolutely. This is what our tax dollars are going towards. And in a country with huge disparities of wealth, where there's such need for improved healthcare, for improved education, all the sort of basic needs that we have for a functioning and fair society, that we would be putting so much money into this system is outrageous.
So just in closing then, Emma, do you have any thoughts about what our audience should do with this information that you're providing us with? Obviously, people are mobilized. You can see that ICE is deeply unpopular, and I think that's caused Trump to do this about turn that he's doing now. And we've mentioned how people in local communities are stopping ICE from buying warehouses. Apparently they're trying to buy a huge Amazon facility, which they put about 10,000 people in. There's the other one that I mentioned down in El Paso that they expect to put 8,500 beds in that one. So beyond that, what do you think can be done?
I mean, I think there's no doubt that people peacefully but loudly speaking up and speaking out and showing up, again, within, abiding by the law, but within their First Amendment rights, is what has pressured Congress to this point to actually finally intervene. And so for people to continue to do that, to speak to their elected representatives, to speak out against detention in their communities, to show up and peacefully protest, has proven itself to be very powerful in this moment. And I hope that people continue to do that.
Well, Emma Winger, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Emma Winger, who's a staff attorney with the American Immigration Council, where she works to protect the rights of non-citizens through affirmative litigation, amicus briefs, and practice advisories for immigration attorneys. She has an article at the American Immigration Council, ICE's secret policy to forcibly enter homes without a judicial warrant threatens all Americans. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into how reactionary and racist backlashes of white victimhood had Andrew Johnson following reformer Abe Lincoln, Richard Nixon following LBJ, and Trump following Obama.
I was at the immigration scene, shining and feeling clean. Could it be a sin? I got stopped by the immigration man. He said he doesn't know if he can let me in. and pray I can stay another day. Let me in, immigration man. I won't toe your line today. I can't see it anyway. There he was with his immigration face.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Julia Azari, who is a professor of political science at Marquette University and the author of Delivering the People's Message, The Changing Politics of the Presidential Mandate, and the editor of The Presidential Leadership Dilemma Between the Constitution and a Political Party. Her latest book is Backlash: Presidents, From Transformative to Reactionary Leaders in American History. And she has an interview at the New York Times. It's all rooted in a sense of victimhood on Trump's backlash presidency. Welcome to Background Briefing, Julia Azari.
Thank you so much.
So you make the case, and it's pretty clear that you're on the money here, that in your 2025 book on backlash presidents, you cite the examples of Andrew Johnson, who came after Abraham Lincoln, Richard Nixon, who came after Lyndon Johnson, and Trump, who came after Barack Obama. And what seems to be the link or the subtext is racism, is it not?
It is, yeah. And the book connects that with the impeachment crises that each of these presidents faced.
So is that to say then that this is an open wound in American history?
I think that's a fair way to say it. And one of the things that I emphasized in particular in the New York Times interview was that this, in some ways, this is all the same conflict playing out differently in different political contexts and different points in time, but that we can trace a lot of the problems back to really not confronting the question of what a multiracial democracy looks like in the decades following the Civil War. And then that process kind of repeated again after civil rights 100 years later. And then that is, I think, pretty clearly playing out now that there's a lot of contestation about what American democracy means and who gets to really count as an American.
Well, I suppose you could take it back even further before the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. George Mason, who was very much the mentor of both Jefferson and Washington, he had the largest library in the New World and was a very wise person, clearly. He didn't sign the Declaration, I understand, because he thought they were trying to finesse slavery and that it would come back to haunt them. And of course, it did with the Civil War.
Yeah, in the book it's really focused, I'm a scholar of political science, and so I really think a lot about institutions. And in the book, I really focus on the Constitution and the way that it's essentially designed to kick these questions down the road and to compromise and to hope that it can compromise these questions away. And of course, that never works.
So how do you feel then about this? There's a couple of words being thrown around a lot lately with the Trump era, the F word, fascism, but there's also the Civil War, the notion of a new Civil War. Where would you rate that possibility?
So I haven't, I'm not a scholar of civil wars, and I haven't looked at this in terms of, what are the key factors behind civil wars. So what I think is fairly clear is that there are really different impressions and understandings of the political meaning of events, and that those events are increasingly involving acts of state violence. And that when there's this contestation over who has legitimate power to use force and to use violence, that really cuts at the basic idea of what it is to be a country. And when those map onto all these existing political conflicts and people's sense of identity and sense of who they are and what it is to be an American, then you certainly have a very volatile situation. The question about how this plays out in terms of organized armed conflicts is kind of beyond my scope, but I think certainly we're in a situation that's very precarious as far as the sense that the government is acting in a way that is legitimate in terms of our public consent and public will, and in terms of our understanding of the Constitution.
Well, I suppose what is happening and what's continuing to happening in Minnesota and in Minneapolis and St. Paul bring that to light, do they not?
Very much. And I think the thing that is concerning, I mean, there are many things that are clearly deeply concerning, but the fundamental idea that the government is somehow at war with its people, that's not my idea. I'm not coming up with that idea. That is something that you are hearing out of people on the ground in Minneapolis and other places. And the idea that that is a possibility is kind of deeply concerning. And for me, a lot of the way that this conflict plays out and the way in which Trump and Trumpism, kind of understand their project is very much about race and being an American. And the selection of the city of Minneapolis is rooted in this example of Somali immigrants and Somali Americans and the sort of linkage with this fraud incident that Trump has really kind of played up in his political rhetoric.
But Trump's appeal to grievance goes beyond his obsession with his own grievances and his own lust for revenge. It clearly connects with a lot of people. Isn't that at the heart of MAGA? And how much is the heart of MAGA about an insecurity that many on the reactionary right feel that the demographic changes in this country will make whites a minority, and being simply born white will no longer confer privilege?
Right. So that's a pretty, I think, common understanding of this movement, and it goes back to the success of MAGA in 2016, even beyond the most recent election. I think there are sort of two things about this that I try to emphasize when bringing a political science perspective to this. And the first one is that this question really is about power, and that is the story that binds all these historical incidents together. In my book, is that after there has been some challenge to racial hierarchy in the United States, there is then this question about, well, what will the power structure look like? Who has power, and who is potentially losing power? And so I think that that's really the heart of it. But the other piece of it, I think, is that there is a hardcore kind of base of the MAGA movement, but that base does not gain political power, and Trump does not gain political power without appealing to people whose politics are much more mainstream, whose views are much more mainstream. And that's where I think there are these pieces of racial politics that are present, that are articulated even among Democrats, despite being the more racially diverse party, about crime, about kind of social order, about affirmative action, about any number of issues that sort of lurk at the edges of politics. And that's where the success kind of lies for MAGA, is that they're not going to win with just hardcore MAGA supporters. It's also the ability to bring mainstream Republicans and independents into that winning coalition by drawing on these ideas that are much more present in mainstream political discourse, and that have been, in this case, going back to the 60s, particularly about kind of crime, criminality, law and order.
So, to quote Abraham Lincoln, is this then a struggle, or a perpetual struggle, about the better angels, either emerging or receding in our history?
That's an interesting kind of moral question. It might be partly that, but I also think that there is a degree to which debates about power are more potent when people feel more threatened, when people feel like their power and control over their own lives are challenged and compromised. And so I think that there are a number of factors of kind of contemporary American life that also feed into this. And so it's not just a matter of the sort of better angels or about a kind of moral purpose, although that was very much Lincoln's idea, that the country has this deeper moral purpose. And I think that's a really great kind of idea to bring people together. But on the other hand, I think part of the problem is a little more material than that. And there's a question about whether Americans feel like they have power in their own lives. And if they don't feel like they do, where do they go kind of seeking that sense of empowerment? What kind of movements and political ideas do they look to find that sense of political empowerment?
Well, is there I sort of see a connection between the people that stood up against slavery and John Brown, etc., and that moral movement against slavery. and the people that are standing up to ICE. These are very brave people. Two of them have been killed, and more have been killed, and a lot of them have been brutalized. But yet they show up and they stand up for what they think is right, and I think they are right. So is that a valid example or a comparison?
I mean, I think that's certainly a comparison that people will draw, and I think you're right that there is a lot of bravery in the face of physical violence and state violence that people are showing. And I do think that there's also this sort of bigger sense, and this goes back to the Lincoln question. There was this bigger sense of people standing up for something because they feel implicated in what the country is doing and because they have a broader moral vision for the country, and not because it necessarily affects them directly. And that's a theme that really resonates through a lot of Lincoln's writings, and this idea, even well before Lincoln became president, he was laying out this idea of the country has sort of lost its way morally, and that the way that this is of course partisan politics. So the way that the kind of Jacksonian Democrats, the other party, had structured the kinds of compromises that they were willing to do, that was dragging the country down morally. And just politics isn't just about getting things done and making compromises day to day, but that the country really ought to stand for bigger ideas. And I do think that is what we're seeing emerge in these debates, is this question about, well, what are we as a country? How do we want to see people treated? What do we want our public institutions to stand for? What are we willing to tolerate? And that's very much, I think, at the core of the protests that you're seeing in Minneapolis and elsewhere against this kind of action. It's not just people acting in their self-interest or treating politics as something to get things done, but engaging in the sense of a deeper moral purpose in the country. And that does have a long and very storied history.
And what about personality? In other words, the personality of the president, who they are, what they think, what they believe, and how much that informs how they act. Because Bertolt Brecht wrote a play, The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, making the point that we look at history in terms of the scope of the activities of mass murderers like Hitler and Stalin and etc., but we don't focus on who they are as human beings. And how, in other words, maybe we wouldn't have had World War II but for the personality of Hitler, and World War I but for the personality of Kaiser Wilhelm. And there's no question that Trump is a flawed human being, to put it incredibly politely. How much do you think that's a factor here? Just do the personalities of leaders and these presidents we're talking about that followed Abraham Lincoln, Richard Nixon following Lyndon Johnson, and Trump, the backlash president after Barack Obama?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's sort of hard to know, right? It's sort of hard to imagine, like, what does this person look like with the kind of different set of character traits. The thing that I actually try to do in the book is look at how much political structure affects presidents who otherwise might have kind of different personalities. I look at that through mostly through the presidents that come kind of in between. And that even presidents who had very kind of racially progressive ideas were often hemmed in by the structures, and also presidents who were more regressive in their ideas weren't necessarily able to do what they want. That really the political structure is doing a lot of the work in my explanation. That being said, one of the things I thought was interesting about Andrew Johnson and Richard Nixon and Donald Trump is that their personality traits get compared a lot. That they had this sort of paranoia about them, this sort of sense of personal political grievance. And I do think that the moments in which these people became president sort of select for those traits, because those traits can help articulate the kind of grievance that is present in politics at these moments, but also the moments kind of exaggerate those characteristics and create opportunities for them to manifest, because there is this sort of politics of grievance. So it's this sort of reinforcing cycle between these personalities. If you had someone who was kind of more, more even keel, less vulnerable to a sense of personal grievance, then maybe things would play out differently. But I think that the moment kind of brings out whatever that trait is in a leader. So yeah, I haven't thought. I mean, obviously, we've all thought a little bit about what would be different if someone else had been elected in 2016 or 2024. I haven't thought a lot about what this would have looked like under a Rubio or Jeb Bush or somebody. But one suspicion that I have is that the grievance politics of the moment would have brought out whatever those traits are in any of those individuals.
But when you say that presidents were hemmed in by the structure being the Constitution, right, and its separation of powers, and the genius of the founding fathers in reacting to the tyranny of a mad king. But now a lot of people think we've got another mad king in the presidency who's pushing the envelope further than any president in our history. How do you see that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Is that so? The example I use there in the book, thinking about race, is really FDR, who was in many ways very, had a very expansive vision of executive politics, but even he was hesitant to push the envelope on the race issue, and that isn't just the structure of the Constitution, but actually the structure of the Senate, which is the Senate's own creation, and the power that Southern senators had in the Democratic coalition. Trump has not been bound by some of these constraints because he has not gone through Congress to do most of his policy goals. One thing that I make of that is that this is the result of a longstanding conservative legal movement that's really been invested in building out and developing executive power. And legal scholars and political scientists and historians have been writing about this since well before Trump was in office, and he has simply capitalized on some of those existing structures. The other thing is that I think this is a movement that's pretty well trained in minoritarian politics and has really never wielded a national majority on most issues, has never really been terribly popular, has never won a national, more than 50% of the popular vote. And so they aren't as constrained by public opinion. And like earlier presidents, was not uncommon to win by much more, and they wanted to maintain those larger numbers and larger coalitions. And now, in general, politics doesn't really work like that. And Trump and Trumpism have especially learned how to maneuver that. And so that, I think, again, kind of goes back to our institutions, not just the Constitution, but those that have developed subsequently, and explains why they're able to do what they do.
Right. Well, in Trump's case, there's a lot of assist from the head of the Supreme Court, John Roberts.
Yes.
Well, Julia, I thank you so much for joining us. I found the interesting conversation. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Julia Azari, who is a professor of political science at Marquette University. She's the author of Delivering the People's Message, The Changing Politics of the Presidential Mandate, and she's the editor of The Presidential Leadership Dilemma Between Constitution and a Political Party. And her latest book is Backlash: Presidents, From Transformative to Reactionary Leaders in American History. And she has an interview at the New York Times. It's all rooted in a sense of victimhood on Trump's backlash presidency. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.